The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good evening and welcome to Reproaction's Act and Learn webinar for the month of February 2020. Tonight's topic is extremely relevant and timely. We're going to talk about marijuana legalization and reproductive oppression. So first we'll introduce your host. The first voice you hear is Erin Matson over there on the left. I use she, her pronouns. I'm based in Arlington, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. And I encourage you to follow me on Twitter at Erin to the Max.
And the second voice is Pamela Merritt. I use she, her pronouns as well. I'm based in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm the other co-founder and co-director of Reproaction, and you can follow me on Twitter at SharkFoo.
All right.
So the agenda for tonight's webinar is going to be a quick introduction of Reproaction for anybody who is attending who's not familiar with our organization. And then I'm going to give a quick introduction of the topic, marijuana legalization and reproductive oppression. Then we're going to dive right into our discussion with each panelist. The first panelist will be Nila Natarajan, who is a supervising attorney, Brooklyn Defender Services, and the Family Defense Practice. And then Lynn Paltrow, who is the founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. After that, we'll go through some next steps, and then there will be a moderated Q&A at the end of the webinar. Throughout the webinar, you can drop questions in the GoToWebinar Control Panel question tab, and at the end of the webinar, I will get through as many of those as possible. Reproaction leads bold direct action to increase access to abortion and advance reproductive justice. We are proud of our left flank analysis, our willingness to hold folks on all sides accountable, whether they identify as allies or opposition, and our commitment to nonviolent direct action. So, we've come a long way since Reefer Madness debuted in 1936. If you haven't had a chance to watch that movie, it is both alarming and hilarious in how it portrays both the physical and emotional impact of smoking weed, but also in the way that it is so clearly propaganda that is playing on some of the top fears that people had in the 1930s. And so I highly recommend it. And some of the images from it are on this slide. But we've really come a long way when it comes to how we culturally represent people who smoke marijuana, either recreationally or medically, and also the impact that it might have on our communities. But legalization is not a simple task. And because it's moving state by state, the status of marijuana in each state is not consistent. Next slide. So I came up with tonight's topic soon after the neighboring state, Illinois, legalized marijuana. As a St. Louisan, I live in a city that is right across a 15-minute drive across the river to another state, Illinois. People, including myself, travel freely between Illinois and Missouri all the time for school. People live in Illinois and work in Missouri and vice versa. So we truly do see Illinois as the Metro East. It's part of our region. But the second Illinois legalized recreational use of marijuana, it became like a different country. So people were unsure about what the implications were of legally purchasing marijuana in Illinois and then driving back to Missouri. One interesting conversation that I noted on the news was, what are the implications of legally smoking and then driving across the river and not even having it on your person, but simply having used the drug. There's a lot of this that hasn't been sorted out. Illinois took some proactive measures to make sure that they addressed the fact that people still have drug convictions on their record from possession or selling marijuana, and they are taking steps to expunge some of those. That's not as simple as it seems, but it is a progressive view of legalization that some states have adopted and some states haven't. There are people who are still incarcerated in states that have legalized and on a drug or marijuana possession charge. So it's a complicated process. And then of course, we have the issue of who is still targeted for increased surveillance as a result of marijuana. For example, in St. Louis, in the state of Missouri, Black drivers are 91% more likely to be pulled over while driving than white drivers in the entire state. And simply the smell of marijuana is often used as cause to do a search of somebody's car. So again, if it's legal in one state and you're driving through another state, what does that all mean? So I had a great discussion with a healthcare provider who works in both states, Illinois and Missouri. And the discussion was about that, the unaddressed issues of public health and policy and regulation. And it really made me realize that legally purchasing weed in one state can have some very complicated implications in another state, and that those implications can be quite severe depending on where an individual sits on the reproductive oppression lens. Next slide. So 11 states in the District of Columbia have passed laws legalizing weed, and all signs point to Arizona, New York, New Jersey, and New Mexico joining that list this year, very soon. So this is a very timely discussion about both the current situation of legalization, making sure that legalization doesn't pass up communities of color, people who have been incarcerated on drug charges, and not most importantly, but certainly of key importance, we want to make sure that a legalized weed includes a robust discussion of, and then addressing through reform, the fact that drug use is still all too often used as addressed through a criminal lens or a surveillance and monitoring lens, investigation lens, when we feel very strongly that it's a public health issue and doesn't belong in that sphere. So even though legalization applies to possession, there are still policies on the book at hospitals or in counties that make using or being suspected of using marijuana very, very complex. Next slide. So just some facts. According to the Guttmacher Institute, 25 states and the District of Columbia require healthcare professionals to report suspected prenatal drug use, and 8 states require them to test for prenatal drug exposure if they suspect drug use. I think it's important to note that this in the real world can mean that if you present at the emergency room and again, you smell of weed, that can be something that is suspected drug use. And while the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, commonly referred to as ACOG, encourages members to advocate against laws that punish people for drug use during pregnancy, the organization also makes it clear that doctors should be aware of the reporting requirements related to alcohol and drug use within their state. So with that, let's get started talking to our experts, shall we? Nila Natarajan is a supervising attorney at Brooklyn Defender Services within the family defense practice. She's testified before both the New York State Legislature and the New York City Council regarding the disparate and punitive treatment of parents who use marijuana. Prior to her work defending parents in child protective proceedings, Nila clerked for the Honorable Arthur J. Tarnow, Senior U.S. District Judge for the Eastern District of Michigan. Ms. Natera Jean graduated from the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And during her time in law school, she worked extensively with incarcerated communities. And she is currently a collective member of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. Welcome, Nila.
Thank you so much.
So let's dive right in, shall we? What drew you to this work and to a focus on family defense?
It's a good question. As you noted, I was working extensively with incarcerated communities before and during law school, and when I graduated and finished clerking, I knew I wanted to work with the most disenfranchised communities, and I wanted to get a true sense of what the kind of intersection of the many systems that I think work to disenfranchise and disempower poor folks and communities of color. And I had always said I didn't want to be a public defender because it would be kind of too much for me to try to work to keep people out of prison, having spent so much time with people who were spending a lot of time in prison, and then kind of landed myself in this role. And it's, we call ourselves public defenders, but just to be clear, we're only representing, in my department at my office, we really only represent parents and caretakers who have child protective cases. So it looks a lot like criminal court, except we're not talking about someone being incarcerated. We're talking about either them and their families being surveilled, their children being removed from their care and placed in foster care, and working to reunite families.
Thank you for that. A follow-up question to that: could you give a good description of kind of who are these parents and caretakers? What communities do they come from?
Absolutely. So I work in Brooklyn, New York, and it's a very diverse community. But the folks that we see in Brooklyn Family Court are largely people who qualify for our services, or they're deemed to be indigent, and so they don't have a lot of resources. They don't have a lot of money, and they're almost all parents and caretakers of color. It's I know that in other parts of New York and other parts of the country that might look different, but I think in almost all regions of our country, the folks most impacted by the child welfare system are people who don't have a lot of resources.
Got it. Thank you. So our webinar attendees are from all over. We're super proud of the wide range of people who view our webinars live, and then obviously we record them, so there's an even larger audience that view them when we share them on social media. So I think it would be helpful to provide some context of how marijuana is viewed legally in New York, and what the child welfare reporting guidelines are.
Sure. So in New York, marijuana is not fully illegalized or decriminalized. Small amounts of possessing marijuana is legal, and one can apply for and receive medical marijuana cards. That being said, and to some extent, I think maybe counterintuitive to a lot of folks who aren't familiar with the system, is that legalization doesn't necessarily change the child welfare reporting guidelines at all, because the kind of perspective that the law and the child welfare system and the court has is about child protection. And so the question is always, is a child safe? And if we're talking about someone who's pregnant, using marijuana and therefore having this prenatal exposure to marijuana, or even a parent who has a child and is using marijuana, the question isn't about whether their use is legal or not in the criminal law, but whether their use is quote unquote in putting their children at risk. So in New York City, we've had some success very recently with Child Protective Services putting out some new guidelines around parents who use marijuana. And there's some great statements like marijuana use alone may not be the basis for finding a child neglectful, or marijuana use alone may not be a basis to remove a child from their parent. But it doesn't necessarily, what we find is it doesn't necessarily change that people are making reports about parents using marijuana, either largely from hospitals, but also from the many other people in the world who might interact with the child and a parent, including schools, neighbors, friends, family, from making calls to Child Protective Services. And what we find is once that process starts, the surveillance starts. And what we find is that the people who end up getting the most severe consequences due to those calls are exactly the type of people who I said we often and mostly see in family court, which are communities of color, immigrant communities, and poor folks.
Got it. So follow-up question to that. I think it's important for people who are not familiar with what Child Protective Service investigation can be like, and how invasive it is, and how long it can, and what are some of the things that can happen. If you could, I know it's hard to say because it does vary a bit, but in your experience, what does a case look like if somebody refers a caretaker or a parent for investigation? What happens?
Absolutely. So when that, at least in New York, when that call is made, there is some screening that occurs. But if it's determined that the call needs further investigation, the local child welfare agency is kind of put on the case, and they are going to go out and try to speak to the parent and the child. But that in and of itself can be very disruptive to a family. It can be someone coming to the house in the middle of the night, asking to come into the home, asking to really look at everything in the home, look into every bedroom, look into the fridge and the cabinets, and very invasively. It could mean asking to speak to children outside of earshot of their parents, so taking children to rooms alone, asking to see a child's full body, so doing something we call a body check. It can mean talking to neighbors, to teachers, to medical providers, all with the aim of wanting to protect children. But when we're talking about cases that come in because someone is maybe using marijuana, it is, I think, a very disproportionate response, and it can be quite invasive. And it's not just one day; it can be over the course of many days, many weeks, and sometimes many months, particularly if the child welfare agency then decides to file a court case against someone. Then you're coming to court and the judge is ordering that Child Protective Services do something called announced or unannounced visits, meaning the government, by the child welfare worker, can come into your home, is ordered to come to your home at any time of the day or night to do again exactly what I just described. And that can last for months, if not years.
Thank you for that. And I want to add, I'm not sure if you've experienced this, but some of the my fellow activists in St. Louis have either worked with people or themselves experienced that kind of investigation. And one of the biggest fears that was articulated to me is that the basic things that people and poor people do to survive are criminalized. So, that if you have somebody, if you're doing hair out of your house, that CPS comes in, they can report you for running a business out of public housing or something like that. So have you experienced that that merely the investigation opens up more investigation?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's a great example. It might mean, it might even mean sometimes that, then child welfare wants to contact any other parent of the child, and let's say there's maybe a past history of an abusive relationship, and then that kind of reopens that in someone's life, or it can cause someone to lose their job, not only because of the actual maybe creation of a record, but because employers, and a lot of our clients don't have the most stable employment. Employers are not really interested in having CPS workers coming to their places of employment looking for people. And I should mention on that note that then if the child welfare system then asks the parent to do something like a substance abuse course that can take hours from the week, sometimes it's 3, 4, 5 days a week for several hours, that makes people lose their employment as well. So there can really be these huge consequences and ramifications that are particularly particularly difficult for someone who's already kind of just, keeping things together, particularly financially.
Exactly. Thank you for that. And then my final question is actually a little bit of a follow-up, but I'm just curious, when we talk about, who the people are who are referring this in New York, who are there mandatory reporters?
Yes. So I'm glad that you raised the question of whether doctors believe, particularly OBGYNs and pediatricians at the time of labor and delivery, believe that they need to make these reports, and oftentimes they do. And I could take it as doctors, they are mandated reporters. I don't want to misstate that, but there is some ambiguity and gray area around what they actually have to call in. And it's my understanding that they have to call in, if they suspect real harm and neglect and abuse of a child. And I think sometimes the actual belief is that they see a positive drug test and they have to make the call. And I don't think that's actually correct. And I would take it a step further and add to that the question then becomes, when are people drug tested? When are newborns drug tested? And the reality is most people don't know that they're being drug tested when they're giving birth. Most people don't know that their newborns are being drug tested after they've given birth. And they only find out once they're presented with the drug test results and are being told that child welfare worker is being called in. And so there's a big question there, especially from a reproductive justice perspective, of informed consent, conversations between medical providers and patients about things like drug use and drug testing. And it's just such a break of that patient-doctor relationship, and there are questions of confidentiality is there as well. But the next step, I would say, is, who are doctors testing then? Why are they testing? And particularly for marijuana, when there is really no medical protocol for a newborn that has potentially been exposed to marijuana in utero. So it becomes a question, I think, of some implicit and explicit bias when it comes to medical providers, and then also on the end of their reporting.
Got it. Wow. Thank you so much, Nila. If you will hang on, I know there's going to be questions for you at the end. And if the attendees have questions, please remember to drop them into the GoToWebinar control panel under the questions tab. Thank you, Nila, and I'm going to hand it over to Erin.
Thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Nila. And I am very pleased to introduce my esteemed colleague and dear friend, Lynn Paltrow JD, who is the founder and executive director of National Advocates for Pregnant Women. She is a graduate of Cornell University and New York University School of Law, and has worked on numerous cases challenging restrictions on the right to choose abortion, as well as cases opposing the prosecution and punishment of pregnant women seeking to continue their pregnancies to term.
That's enough.
Yeah. Are you trying to cut me off here?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I will let you read the rest, but let me tell you, see, Lynn, the risk of doing that means that I go off script. And I have to say that Lynn is shatteringly brilliant and has spearheaded the legal framework for how we challenge unjust treatment of pregnant people in the United States. And we're just so thrilled to have you tonight. So thank you, Lynn. So, so first, let's dive right in. And my first question is to help us understand the big picture. Specifically, how do we get to a place where drug use is being used to specifically target women and people who can become pregnant?
That's a great question. And what I've seen is this incredible intersection of the war on abortion, particularly the war on abortion as it's justified by claims of separate rights for fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses. So you have a war on abortion, you have a war on drugs, and you have the ongoing endless racism in the United States. And so in the late 80s, early 90s, you had prosecutors who started targeting particularly Black women accused of using crack cocaine. And I clarify that crack cocaine is just cocaine, the same drug that in the 1970s was in epidemic use in its powdered form, primarily by rich white people, but targeting Black women who smoke crack and making the claim that that drug use was unquestionably causing them to have babies who were permanently damaged, unrecognizable, in school with your white middle class children sucking away tax dollars. And it very quickly became, the argument was that if you took the drug war, so drugs are bad, people who take them are bad, and then you add that to the claim that fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses are persons. If the prosecutors won these cases, and what they would do is charge a woman with child endangerment and argue that what was endangering was their drug use and the child was the fetus inside of them. So they could use the criminal child endangerment law, or they could use the criminal delivery of drugs to a minor law, claiming the delivery of drugs occurred through the umbilical cord. They tried assault with a deadly weapon by being pregnant and using controlled substances. And women were also being arrested for drinking alcohol, but the primary early targets were Black women who used cocaine. And Dorothy Roberts' book, Killing the Black Body, talked a great deal about that. And the power of combining the war on drugs, the war on abortion, and particularly the war on Black women created the ideology that you could hold pregnant people criminally liable, not even for harm that they did, but merely for risking harm.
Okay, so I have a couple of follow-up questions before getting into the next topic. So just one question I have is, when we look and talk about criminalization of behaviors, one of the things that often unites the decriminalization movements is this realization that it's not, in fact, the behaviors that are being targeted, but a specific group of people. And I want to just toss that back to you. Would you say that's what's happening here?
Well, I'm not sure which here you mean, but it's important. One of the things that is important for those listening is there is a natural alliance between those fighting the drug war and mass criminalization and those seeking to ensure that the right to choose abortion and to have the health care you need, the human health care you need if you happen to be the kind of human who can get pregnant. The drug war was created as a mechanism for controlling certain populations. Marijuana was criminalized based on the presentation that it was Mexicans who used marijuana, and opium was criminalized to control Chinese immigrants who were no longer needed to build our railroads. And cocaine was criminalized based on the absolute lie that Black men used it and raped white women. So they criminalized certain drugs as a way of controlling certain communities. And what we know, and this is one of the things that intersects, is prohibition doesn't work. You prohibit people from drinking alcohol, they still drink alcohol. You prohibit people from using certain drugs, they keep using those drugs. You prohibit people from having abortions, they still have abortions. And so if the people who do the criminalizing know that it's not going to work, you ask yourself, well, why do they keep doing it? And the answer is, we know that none of those prohibitions are enforced equally to all people. They are used to control certain populations, and those populations are typically brown and Black people and poor white people. And so we have a stake in everybody. We're saying that health issues that might involve drugs, that might involve the consequences of sex, including pregnancy, that those are health issues, and none of them are appropriate for control by any punitive state system, whether it's the criminal justice system or the so-called civil child welfare system that I like to call the domestic family separation system.
Well, that is, thank you for that. And that is a good seg to please tell us what the criminal and civil child welfare system, or as you call it, the domestic family separation system, responses to marijuana use during pregnancy are.
Well, those responses vary from state to state. I think just to go back and sort of talk about places of disconnect, and whether we're talking about the drug policy reform movement or the mainstream pro-choice movement, neither has paid much attention to the family separation system in this country. Reproductive justice, articulated and defined by women of color, talks about having to understand it's not just about whether you have an abortion or not, whether you have a child or not, it's also, do you get to raise and keep your children in safe communities? So in Colorado, for example, when folks were working to decriminalize and legalize marijuana, it didn't occur to them to think about what the consequences might be in the civil child family separation system. And it turned out that the law in Colorado and family law effect around child welfare is individualized. It's different in every state. In Colorado, it says that if a child tests positive at birth for either a Schedule I or Schedule II drug, which includes marijuana, that parent can be found guilty of child neglect. So they didn't anticipate the fact that somebody could, once it was legalized, use marijuana while pregnant, give birth, and then not get arrested, but have their child taken away. And that has implications across the country. The New York Times, in a series called "A Women's Rights," reported the story of a couple who, husband and wife, she got pregnant while they lived in Colorado. They ended up in Massachusetts, and when she went to give birth, they asked her about any drug use or anything else, and she said, "Oh yeah, when I was in Colorado, I smoked marijuana. It was legal." In Massachusetts, their misinterpretation of their own state law was that they then had to report her for using marijuana while pregnant. So it wasn't a question of legality or not, it was a question of taking certain things like evidence of drug use and treating them as evidence of child abuse. And that's just irrational and without any scientific support. The big pharma, big pharma and testing companies have made drug testing ubiquitous in the workplace, making us think that we all have to get agreed to be drug tested before we can fold shirts or sweep floors or work a cash register. And they have convinced more and more states and certain places to also drug test people who are pregnant, who've given birth, at great profit to themselves. So as a result of the anti-abortion movement's claim that fetuses, embryos are persons, and the drug war, we saw two things happening. One, women who gave birth and tested positive for any drug, including marijuana, were being arrested. Now, all of these arrests occurred because individual prosecutors were taking existing criminal laws and trying to expand them. No criminal law said you can arrest a woman because she's pregnant and uses drugs. And I just want to point out, it's very important to say pregnant and use drugs, not use drugs while pregnant, because the drug use wouldn't have been criminalized but for the pregnancy. So it was the sneaky way of basically criminalizing pregnancy and drug use, or pregnancy in some cases and alcohol use, or pregnancy and maybe falling down a flight of stairs. And sometimes the drug that the women tested positive for was marijuana. And then we started to see more and more states, as in New York, and I would perhaps say things even more strongly than Nila. New York state law does not mandate reporting for evidence of drug use, any drug use, including marijuana, while pregnant. It says you have to report abuse and neglect, and then defines it as it could be drug use or alcohol, but that's evidenced by falling down, not being able to take care of yourself or your children. That's what people have an obligation to report. You cannot tell if somebody can parent based on a cup of urine or a blood test. It can tell you that somebody used a drug within a certain period of time. It can't even tell you if somebody's dependent on it or how it affects them. It certainly can't tell you whether they love their children and take care of their children. And yet across the country, families are being separated on nothing more than that.
Thank you for that, Lynn. And I just want to underscore the point you made about companies making a great deal of profit off this testing. I mean, it's another angle of this that is often not talked about. One thing that I want to ask you to explicate for our listeners. So at Reproaction, we believe very strongly as a reproductive justice organization that we must resist separating families and separating children from their parents, including when there are allegations of substance use, and that often does great harm to separate families. You talked a bit about the legality, but just can you talk a bit, this is something that we notice on the ground when we're organizing that people tend to stumble with, and there's been so much programming in the media and in popular culture that families must be separated if a parent is using substances. What are the impacts and outcomes of separating families?
Well, we know that it's incredibly destructive. Bonding, security, all of those things help people build strong families, build strong selves. And there's far more evidence that separating children from their parents, putting them in strangers' homes, there are people who much better than I, talk about how similar the family separation system is to the criminal injustice system. In both places, you're surveilled all the time. In both places, you have to move from cell to cell, putting your stuff in a pillowcase. You're a kid in the child welfare system. All you might have is a pillowcase for the things they grabbed out of your house and then move you from foster care house to foster care house. And there are even studies, and I'm sure Nila can confirm this, that say, look, there are rare, occasionally really, really violent parents that kids need to be separated from. But by and large, the cases are about neglect, which are really about poverty. And instead of focusing on addressing the housing and the poverty and the lack of community support, child welfare comes in, uses that money to put children in foster care systems, and then pretends that they can fix individuals rather than address the real issues that those families face. I forgot the rest of the question. Can you remind me?
That's it. So I just wanted you to talk a bit about the outcomes and the impacts when families are separated, because frequently when we're organizing on the ground, what we run up against is people will say, well, absolutely, I believe in bodily autonomy and that people shouldn't have a separate set of civil and human rights when they're pregnant versus when they're not. But when it comes down to brass tacks of this idea of, well, what should happen with children, sometimes we even see activists who are very well-intentioned stumble with that. So that was helpful for you to talk through.
Well, Here's the best answer or experience story I can tell. I often give a talk where I bring a cup and I pee in it and I hold it up as an example. And I say, there's nothing about this that can tell you how I parent. But if you're a child welfare worker whose job it is to decide if somebody's a good enough parent, we don't have any objective standards for that. If somebody's living in dire poverty, that's not good for any children or the adults. So if you're in that position, it's so comforting to have something that seems like an objective test. Oh, if it's a positive drug test, then let me separate this family. But the only reason the state isn't a good parent, you know, when I have parenting issues, I don't call up my state legislator or the child welfare department because they're not going to actually help me. You only want the state to come in if the person is really, really creating a risk. If we really believed that evidence of drug use or alcohol use meant somebody couldn't parent, we'd test everybody. Every parent, whether they're dropping their kids off at a fancy private school or public school, would have to pee in a cup. And if it's positive, we take your kids away. We don't do that because we know that many, many people use drugs, drink alcohol, and even have problems with those substances and still take good enough care of their kids. I know I wouldn't have been better off had I been put into foster care or taken away on the nights, not often, when my parents drank so much they blacked out. Could have been a fire, something could have been, but I would not have been better off had somebody found out about that, reported, and took me away. And unlikely to happen in a white middle-class family. So what you want to do is try to keep families together. And one key point about this is the one drug around which there's some symptoms is for people who are using opioids while pregnant or even using treatments for opioids, their babies can be born with some transitory and treatable withdrawal symptoms. We know how to deal with them. The best way to deal with them is to keep the mothers and babies together. The research shows that allowing the babies to bond with their moms, have skin-to-skin contact, and breastfeed is actually the healthiest, most cost-effective thing we can do. But if we think of those moms as child abusers, those babies get taken away, put in the most expensive part of the hospital, the NICU, and we undermine and we put the kids in the most unnatural setting, a NICU, a neonatal intensive care unit. So the last thing we want to do is create a climate in which we view anything a person does while they're pregnant as a form of child abuse. It's being pregnant. And giving birth isn't a form of harm, and experiencing a pregnancy loss, which 15 to 20% of women do, isn't causing harm or killing babies. It is just what it means to be a biological human.
Thank you for that. Okay, in about a minute, we are an activist organization. That is the primary viewership for these webinars. So as marijuana legalization keeps moving through the states on a state-by-state basis, what can activists do to make sure that reforms needed to end both criminal and civil welfare responses to drug use during pregnancy are included in those reforms on marijuana legalization overall?
Very important. They're very happy to say that among the people who have supported our work the most are folks at the Drug Policy Alliance. It's very important to work across issues so that people advocating for marijuana legalization are talking to parent defense lawyers, parent activists, experts in child welfare and in criminalization of regarding pregnancy, and they talk to each other. So for example, as in New York, as efforts are being made to legalize marijuana, I'm very proud of the fact that people working out of the drug policy community and the reproductive rights, health, and justice community and parent defense are all talking to each other. And that's the most important thing that can happen, is that we work collectively to say, we don't want people to go to jail, but we want nobody left out of the protections we hope to have by ending this ridiculous war on drugs, which is a war on people. And I do just want to acknowledge Nila and the organization she works for, that it is only because of strong parent defense that we have any hope of challenging a system that transforms a positive drug test, marijuana test for a Black mother into a form of child abuse, while, as Emma Ketteringham has written in an op-eds, while a white mother can write an op-ed about how smoking a little pot helps her to be a better parent and never worry that there will be a knock on the door from family separation representatives.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you for closing this portion of the discussion right where it belongs, which is on racism, and that is really what is being attacked here, or who is being prosecuted here. So please put in questions for Lynn in the chat box. I'm sure you've got them. And I am going to move us to the next segment of our webinar. So want to encourage you all to sign up for action alerts at www.reproaction.org. We run these Act and Learn webinars every month. They are free. They are open to the public. And I promise you'll never miss an invite if you sign up for our email list. You're also encouraged to follow us on social media, where we have all sorts of fun stuff going on. We are Reproaction on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And please save the date for our next Act and Learn webinar. It will take place on Tuesday, March 31st at 3 p.m. Eastern. And next month's topic is Lies, Misogyny, and Recklessness. The Anti-Abortion Fake Clinic Movement Goes Global. We're very excited about this. We're doing this webinar in conjunction with our colleagues and partners at Open Democracy, which has recently published a horrifying story about the encroachment of Heartbeat International and Human Life International and the fake clinic work that is going on overseas, and in particular that some of the treatment that people are getting going into those centers is indeed worse than what's happening in the United States. So, and those are US-based agencies. So we're really excited to have this webinar. It is because we're working with colleagues from the European Union that we're doing it in the middle of the afternoon instead of the evening to spare the 8-hour plus time difference. So we hope you'll be able to join us. And with that, I will pass it back to Pamela to lead Q&A.
Thank you so much, Erin. So I have unmuted Lynn and Nila, and we do have questions. I know we touched on this a bit, but I think it's always good to go through it again. But Leslie has asked, in states where cannabis is fully decriminalized, how does that flow down to mandatory reporting laws? I'll give that question first to Lynn.
I'm not sure. I think this is the right answer. I think if the state or the hospital or the county, because often child welfare practices can differ from one county to another, there's nothing about legalization that automatically stops or report the belief by certain members of the hospital or medical staff that they have an obligation to report. And there's all sorts of confusion about a federal law, CAPTA, that really is a direction to state authorities. And the states, if they want to get a certain amount of federal money for child abuse prevention, have to promise that there's some mechanism for connecting children who test positive or drug affected, not test positive, but drug affected or in withdrawal, to child welfare. And they're not required to define it as child abuse, but once you're reported to child welfare, they investigate you for child abuse. Mm-hmm. And many people misunderstand that law, think it's a directive that mandates testing. It does not. A directive that mandates reporting positive tests. It does not. Or even that it's a mandated system to hospitals. But there are more than 20 states that have laws that do say if there is a positive drug test, and marijuana is often included in that, there is reporting. It doesn't necessarily mean that somebody will have their child removed, but it could well mean that. And in some states like Alabama, it could then be followed by an arrest as well. So if you're working for marijuana legalization, you also have to work to ensure that everybody, whether they're in the criminal injustice system or the family separation system, are protected.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Nila, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I was just going to add that Lynn's maybe made it very clear, but legalization in and of itself, or decriminalization even, will not change practices of the child. I like what Lynn called it, the domestic family separation system is not going to change how they work until activists and advocates work to change either very specific child welfare law on the local level, or even better, I would say, is actual policy within the child welfare system and the healthcare system. The reporting and treatment of families around marijuana use is not going to change. Mm-hmm. And I have to emphasize that it's not the legality, it's the perception of the people who are getting snared into this system as bad parents because of their marijuana use. So I feel strongly that there are likely parents out there who are white and middle class who may be testing positive for marijuana. I don't know if they're even being tested, but are using marijuana, who are not being drawn into this system. So as long as this unconsented to, and I would argue sometimes medically unnecessary drug testing is happening, and then the reporting is happening, it's going to be poor Black and brown folks who get ensnared into the system, and the legalization itself is not going to change that.
And Nil, I just want to validate everything you said, but there's very little medical basis for testing. There's no exposure to marijuana does not to any of the controlled substances doesn't give you information that then allows you to do any kind of treatment. There's no need for treatment. And even babies that are born with a withdrawal sequence, which is associated with opioids, those withdrawal sequences are also seen with SSRIs and nicotine and probably many other things. So the drug testing is not actually giving anybody medical information. It's giving them information they can use against parents in the social and legal systems.
And I want to emphasize this because I think people feel rightfully that the legalization will make a change, but because the system itself is so racist and classist and out there, I think, to really judge parents and family, I've seen alcohol use treated in this, manipulated and used against parents in the same way. And alcohol, as we know, is fully legal. So I was in a courtroom and I heard a child welfare worker ask the prosecuting attorney to ask a parent to take a drug test. And the judge said, why? The allegations I have here in front of me have nothing to do with substance use. And the worker said, well, the parent said they like to have a beer every night. Mm-hmm. And so that was a perfect example to me of how if you put it's kind of like a hammer and a nail or whatever, but if you, it's not really about the drug use, it's about wanting, I think, to judge and surveil and control certain parents and certain families. So we have to think at the micro level about policy in order to make a real change, because the legality itself doesn't necessarily take away that judgment.
Thank you for that. And that is, we can't say that enough, because legalization is moving and people need to understand the work that needs to go into that. And so there's a question to that, Nila, that, and Lynn can weigh in as well, but first to Nila, that in New York, where legalization is moving, our advocates for caretakers, or, just people who are generally concerned about the reproductive justice and human rights implications of a decriminalization, but not having addressed these policy issues. Are folks working together, and is that being incorporated in the move to legalize?
Yes, I'm very happy to say that, particularly with leadership from the Drug Policy Alliance, who has this SMART, it's an acronym SMART, legislation for decriminalizing marijuana. It's quite broad, and I think because of advocacy for many, many years from parents and from parent defenders, that legislation includes some clear language about marijuana legalization in the context of the child welfare system. And I think it's part of a broad set of decriminalization measures in the New York State legislation that's actually kind of holding back marijuana legalization right now, because I think there's a strong contingency of people who are saying we're not going to decriminalize this without addressing the full harms that criminalizations has already created, and will continue to create if we don't be proactive and very specific about the type of legislation we put forward. So it's there, it's before the state legislature, it's crossing my fingers it will be passed, and I hope it'll be passed without kind of some backdoor taking out some of these key pieces that can really, I think, help the people I think we want to help the most by decriminalizing marijuana.
That's awesome. Lynn, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Well, yes, and that is that there's amazing, as Nila describes, collaboration, but also to say that these things take a lot of time and a lot of commitment, and especially to the extent that it requires changing some of how business is done as usual within the family separation system. The New York City Council had hearings on this issue last year, and it was really quite amazing. You had parent defense lawyers and parent after parent describing situations in which, for no other reason than giving birth and having a positive drug test, child welfare was notified and came in and took children away. And then you'd have people from the Administration for Children's Services, what they call the child welfare, child protection system here in New York City, saying, oh, that's not our policy. We don't do that. So it's, even when there may be people high up who kind of get that this shouldn't be the policy, bringing about fundamental change requires everyone listening, all of us, to think about long-term commitment, what it really takes to change systems, and including the belief systems people have, which make it easy to say, well, we can hold somebody accountable for drug use, and then we'll be sure the child is safe. But we only think that about Black and brown parents, poor white parents, and we don't have to fix the things that are really threatening, chemically threatening. For example, lead in the water in Flint, Michigan. That actually can damage children in serious, identifiable ways. No one has talked about holding any of the people there legally responsible for harming children.
Hear, hear. So I hate to do this, but I'm going to toss it out anyway, Lynn. There's a great question. We have 2 minutes. How is the current rural opiate epidemic different and similar to the introduction of crack cocaine in terms of child removal and parental arrests?
There's a general valid critique that in some kind of overarching way, the response to the so-called opioid epidemic has been gentler and kinder and more focused on treatment, because the image of opioid users are white people. The place where I've seen that to be particularly not true is when it comes to pregnant people. The majority of current arrests around pregnancy and drug use are rural white women, and proportionately so. It's not just that they're a majority of the arrests, it's proportionately so. We see similar things around the child welfare system. I think, Nila, you could probably speak better to that in terms of what you see happening in New York and opioid use.
Yeah, I want to say I'm happy to report. I think the epidemic, quote unquote, hasn't really gotten to Brooklyn quite yet, as hard as it's hit other communities. And I think it's correct. We know that it's hit rural white communities harder at this point. And what I have heard from my colleagues is in more rural parts of New York, it's not good, and it's really horrible. And I think Lynn is absolutely correct that the way the epidemic is talked about in our popular culture is a little bit gentler and softer. And I think that's really not to kind of repeat myself, but that's really about, I think, relatability. I think that people in power who tend to be white people and middle class people may find it more relatable when the face of something like this is white folks. And then that's why we talk about treatment, but it doesn't mean that I think when it comes to pregnant people, and Lynn's absolutely right about this, that level of relatability or gentleness goes away, and people get really kind of hyper focused on the baby and not the parent. I would refer folks to someone named Dr. Ron Abrams, who's a doctor in Canada, who does amazing work with people who are pregnant and delivering, who also use substances, and from a medical perspective talks about how to keep babies and birthing parents together and effects on their children. And the reason I raise it is there's a model out there for when we have resources, how to keep families together. And the reality is that we're not using it because we don't want to use the resources to that end. And instead we use so much money to keep children in foster homes. In New York City, a foster parent might get somewhere between $800 and $1,000 a month. And that money put towards the health and well-being of a whole family could go a long way to reduce the harm that comes from separation.
Very true. And I could talk to both of you forever, but we are a little bit over time. So we're going to have to end there. Thank you so much, Nila, Lynn. This has been an amazing discussion. So thank you for your time and your expertise and your work. And thank you to our attendees for great questions. And please know that we will have a recording of this that we hope you share far and wide. Thank you always to Erin Matson, my co-pilot. And I hope everybody has a fantastic rest of your evening. Take care.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.